Good evening, darlings. So I got an anonymous request which asked me to do a little bit of life advice. So welcome to the first episode of Greenwood Talks in a very, very long time. So tonight I have an anonymous question which says, Dear King Thranduil, how do you deal with coworkers who you don't get on with? Any advice would be appreciated. I'm being driven mad. Well, darling, I absolutely understand that, haven't we all? Now, it is difficult, of course, to deal with those sort of less than pleasant sorts, particularly those who sort of get into your business, whether it be the actual business of work or whether it's your personal sort of business. I find it's best to think about sort of the work that you do have to do. If they're sort of prying into your personal life, that can be very difficult if they're sort of near you in the office, or I suppose it depends, you may not be in an office. But if there's sort of a physical proximity, that makes it very, very difficult. But I try to sort of go by the rule of be pleasant when you think of not so kind thoughts. It doesn't always work, of course. And I think I've mentioned before, many, many months ago, of course, smiling is always good because even if you don't sort of believe it, sometimes you can sort of fake it till you make it. It's a very famous line, fake it till you make it, but I do live by that advice almost every day. So it is good to sort of try to put on the best face that you can, even when on the inside you want nothing more but to slit their throat. And so it's really something that sort of takes a little bit of practice. It's not sort of something you can just flick a switch and it suddenly works. If it's more sort of people getting into what you're doing and sort of micromanaging or just trying to do everything that you've already done or that you're trying to get done, that's sort of a little bit more difficult. Of course, I think communication is always the best, although usually in these cases it's those people who don't like to listen who are the ones that you have to deal with in these situations. It's always the way, darling. It's always, always the way, and it's always terrible. So I suppose what I would have to say is just to try to be as patient as possible. And darlings, that's something I struggle with a lot in my personal life, in my work life. Just sort of being allowed to do my job so that I can get through it much more quickly. But I think if you sort of take a handful of patience in one hand, and then in the other a wine glass or whatever it is that helps you get through the day. And if that second part is not applicable logistically or what have you, then what should you do? I try to sort of think of things positive that are to come. This is a very common game that I play with myself. It's how much of the percent of the day have I already completed? This is, I think, a very common game for many of us who have terrible things that we have to get through in a day. So you play the game of sort of calculating the exact amount of hours and minutes you have left, and then you can sort of continue on if that doesn't seem to pass any time, and sort of do percentages. How much do you have? And then if you factor in your lunch, how much do you have? It's sort of a fun little game that sort of drives you crazy, actually. It's really terrible advice. But it's something I find myself doing a lot. And sometimes if I find that I'm already 30% through the day, it makes it a little bit easier to deal with some of the less than savory people I have to deal with, If you know that you only have 2 hours left, only 2 hours left. I can deal with this person for just 2 more hours. 3 I couldn't do, but just 2, I can do that. So that's sort of the kind of mindset I like to put myself in on particularly difficult days. But, it really sort of depends on your situation, doesn't it? And it can be very, very difficult. So I would say try to be as patient as possible. You know, I think sometimes it's very easy to let those little pet peeves sort of explode if you don't sort of clamp down on them. And I think sometimes try to think of the best possible scenario for why they're doing it. You know, I've had coworkers who have, you know, sort of tried to do paperwork that I'm in the middle of doing. And what I found after I talked to them about why, it was because they saw that I was busy, or they thought I was busy, and they sort of had a free moment, so they were trying to actually assist me. So sometimes it's just sort of a point of view thing, and if you sort of try to look at it more from their side of things, you realize that the scenario isn't really quite so dire as you thought. And that's something I try to do a lot, because of course it really does help. But sometimes even then it can be a little bit difficult in the moment, you know. Looking back, of course, reflection is so much more simple, but you know, try to have as much patience as you can with the other person, and you know, just try to think positively. Always think positively, and then when you get home, do something as a reward if you've had a particularly difficult day, and try to sort of make a positive association with that person, just to make it a little bit less difficult. Always hum a tune that you really like in your head whenever you have to deal with them, or something, just to sort of ease the tension. I find it really does help. So I hope some of this advice is helpful for you, darling. Of course, it's been a long time since I've dished out any advice, but I do hope that you find some of it useful. And best of luck with those difficult co-workers, darling. I absolutely understand. Cheers. And I will see you all next week. So until then, cheers and ta-ta.